In the golden corridors of Hollywood's most legendary studio, one man made a decision that would haunt him forever. While the world fell in love with Rick's Café Américain, Hal Wallis watched his greatest gamble crumble into cinema history's most bitter irony. He saw a flop history saw art. This is the untold story of the producer who bet against his own masterpiece. The year was 1942, and Hal Wallis sat behind his mahogany desk at Warner Brothers, staring at a script that would change everything. But little did the world know, this wasn't a moment of triumph, it was a moment of profound doubt. The pages before him told the story of an American expatriate running a nightclub in wartime Morocco, a tale ripped from an unproduced play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. Wallis had built his reputation on producing crowd pleasers, not art house experiments. The angels with dirty faces, the Maltese Falcon, these were his victories. But Casablanca? This felt different. Dangerous, even. The script was incomplete, the ending uncertain, and America had just entered World War II. Anti-Nazi films were risky business when the country was still divided on intervention. As he flipped through the pages, Wallis couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding either a masterpiece or a disaster. The characters were complex, morally ambiguous, nothing like the clear-cut heroes audiences expected. Rick Blaine wasn't your typical leading man. He was cynical, wounded, selfish. Would audiences embrace such darkness in their escapist entertainment? The producer's instincts, honed by decades in Hollywood's ruthless machinery, whispered warnings. This wasn't commercial material. This was the kind of picture that critics might love, but audiences would ignore. In the projection rooms of his mind, Wallis could already see empty theaters and disappointed exhibitors. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, or so he believed. What Wallis couldn't foresee was that sometimes the greatest art emerges not from calculated decisions, but from moments of uncertainty, when creators dare to trust their hearts over their heads. The reluctant visionary was about to birth a legend, even as every fiber of his being told him to walk away. The signs seemed to align against Casablanca from the very beginning, as if fate itself was testing Hal Wallis's resolve. Europe was burning, and Hollywood was struggling to find its voice in wartime. Anti-Nazi sentiment was still controversial. Many Americans remained isolationist, and the studios feared alienating audiences. When Wallis greenlit Casablanca, he wasn't just betting on a movie. He was betting on America's moral awakening. The casting process became a nightmare of complications. George Raft, Warner's biggest star, had already turned down the Maltese Falcon and would later reject Casablanca, two decisions that would define him as the man who said no to immortality. Ronald Reagan was briefly considered for Rick Blaine, a casting choice that would have transformed cinematic history. But Wallis's doubts weren't about the leads, they were about everything else. The supporting cast reads like a United Nations of refugees. Konrad Veidt, the German actor playing Major Strasser, had fled Nazi Germany in real life. S.Z. Sekal, who played Karl the waiter, had lost family members to the concentration camps. Madeleine Lebeau, playing Yvonne, was a genuine French refugee who had escaped occupied France. The weight of authentic tragedy hung over every scene, making the production feel less like entertainment and more like a documentary of displacement. Wallis watched the dailies with growing unease. The performances were powerful, too powerful perhaps. This wasn't the light escapism that had made Warner Brothers profitable. Instead, he was witnessing something rawer, more honest than anything Hollywood typically produced. A scene where the refugees sing La Marseillaise to drown out the Nazi anthem wasn't just acting, it was catharsis for actors living their own exile. Every day brought new confirmation of Wallis's fears. This wasn't a movie. It was an emotional powder keg wrapped in the guise of a love story. And in 1942 America, Powder kegs had a dangerous habit of exploding in the faces of those who lit them. Screenplay troubles that plagued Casablanca would have killed a lesser project, but they only deepened Hal Wallace's conviction that he was producing a commercial disaster. Julius and Philip Epstein, the twin brothers tasked with adapting Everybody Comes to Rick's, seemed to delight in making everything more complicated than necessary. Where Hollywood demanded simple emotions, they delivered complexity. Where audiences expected clear resolutions, they offered ambiguity. The famous "Play It Again" Sam line, which Ingrid Bergman never actually says, became symbolic of everything that was going wrong. The writers kept changing dialogue, refining scenes, adding layers of meaning that Wallace feared would sail over the heads of moviegoers looking for simple entertainment. Every revision made the characters more human and the story less commercial. Howard Koch joined the writing team, bringing his passion for anti-fascist themes that made studio executives nervous. The political undertones weren't subtle. They were practically shouting from every scene. In an era when Hollywood preferred to avoid controversy, Casablanca was building controversy into its very DNA. Wallace could imagine the protests, the boycotts, the angry letters from isolationist groups. Most damning evidence of impending failure came from the script's most famous element, uncertainty. Even as filming progressed, nobody knew how the movie would end. Would Ilsa leave with Victor or stay with Rick? The writers were literally making it up as they went along, a creative process that violated every principle of successful commercial filmmaking. Wallace had witnessed enough Hollywood productions to know that movies succeeding without a solid ending from day one were virtually non-existent. The greatest films followed formulas, gave audiences what they expected. Casablanca was becoming everything a successful movie shouldn't be: unpredictable, morally complex, and politically charged. The writing wasn't just on the wall. It was carved in stone, spelling out commercial doom in letters tall enough for any producer to read. Humphrey Bogart had never been Hollywood's idea of a romantic leading man, and Hal Wallace knew it. At 43, with his weathered face and distinctive lisp, Bogart was more character actor than matinee idol. When other producers were casting Gary Cooper or Clark Gable types, Wallace was betting everything on a man who looked like he'd been living hard for decades. The gamble seemed doomed from the start. Bogart's recent successes, High Sierra, The Maltese Falcon, had established him as a tough guy, not a romantic hero. His chemistry test with Ingrid Bergman had been adequate at best, lacking the spark that defined great screen couples. Wallace watched those early scenes with a sinking heart, wondering if he'd just destroyed his leading lady's career, along with his own. But something magical was happening in front of the cameras that wasn't translating to the producer's worried eyes. Bogart was creating a new kind of screen, hero vulnerable beneath the cynicism, romantic despite the hardened exterior. Rick Blaine wasn't the traditional knight in shining armor. He was a man who'd lost faith in everything except his own survival instincts. This complexity terrified Wallace, who feared audiences would reject such moral ambiguity. The famous scenes between Bogart and Bergman crackled with an tension that seemed almost accidental. Their age difference, he was older, she was luminous, created and dynamic, that felt real rather than manufactured. But Wallace couldn't see past the commercial risks. Older leading men with younger leading ladies were nothing new, but usually the men were conventionally handsome. Bogart was interesting, compelling, even magnetic, but handsome in the traditional sense. Wallace had his doubts. Every day of filming reinforced the producer's conviction that he was witnessing a career-ending mistake. Bogart was giving the performance of his lifetime, creating a character that would define screen masculinity for generations. But Hal Wallace could only see the ways it defied every rule of successful commercial filmmaking, every principle that had made him one of Hollywood's most successful producers. Ingrid Bergman arrived on the Casablanca set carrying the weight of Hollywood's expectations, and Hal Wallace's growing anxiety. Fresh from her triumph in For Whom the Bell Tolls, she was supposed to be the element that made everything work, a star power that would salvage Wallace's increasingly expensive gamble. Instead, she became another source of his mounting dread. The problem wasn't Bergman's talent, even. Wallace couldn't deny her luminous screen presence. The issue was her approach to the role of Ilsa Lund. She kept asking questions that had no answers. Why does Ilsa really love Rick? What happened in Paris? How does she really feel about Victor? These weren't the concerns of a typical Hollywood actress delivering lines. These were the questions of an artist trying to find truth in incons. Fiction. Wallace watched in horror as Bergman insisted on motivating every line, finding psychological depth in what he'd hoped would be straightforward melodrama. She was transforming Ilsa from a simple love interest into something far more complex, a woman torn between duty and passion, between the man who saved her and the man who awakened her. This complexity was exactly what Wallace feared would confuse audiences expecting clear-cut romantic choices. The famous airport scenes became exercises in controlled chaos. Nobody knew until the final moment whether Ilsa would leave with Victor or stay with Rick. And Bergman's uncertainty translated into a performance of Remarka.